It's a pleasure and honor to have Professor Olabisi Akinkugbe join us for a webinar on the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is being organized by the International Law Association Nigerian Branch Committee on Business and Human Rights. And the idea behind this webinar is to look at the trade agreement, the only trade agreement we have in Africa, and how can we unlock the opportunities arising from that trade agreement, especially with relevance to the impact on Nigeria's trade relations. As we all know, there are currently 54 signatories, and the agreement aims to create the largest free trade area globally, and it has a potential to reshape intra-African trade. And therefore, this webinar seeks to discuss the opportunities and the challenges, the policy frameworks, and the strategic actions which is needed to optimize principally Nigeria's participation. And of course, we can also expand to other African countries in the trade agreements framework, and also how Nigeria or countries can strengthen their trade relations within Africa. What's left for me is to introduce a guest speaker who needs no introduction, really. Professor Olabisi Akikugbe is the Paul D. Crawford Chair in Business Law and Associate Professor at the School of Law, Dalhousie University in Canada. He previously served as the Viscount Bennett Professor of Law at the School of Law, and was the convener of the annual Viscount Bennett Roundtable on International Economic Law. His research covers several topics on issues around intersection of public international law, international economic law, human rights law and development, international courts, and regional integration in Africa. And he looks at these issues from a wide area of expertise. It draws from critical traditions such as the social legal approaches to law, post-colonialism, and the third world approaches to international law. Professor Kikugbe holds several leadership positions within international law at international economic law journals. In 2023, he was appointed as section editor International Decisions and Decision Essays in the American Journal of International Law. In 2020, he co-founded and served as the co-editor-in-chief of the African Journal of International Economic Law. And he also contributed, he actually he co-seeded a new and thriving academic community when he co-founded Afronomics with Professor James T. Gaffey, which I must add, Afronomics is actually collaborating with us on this webinar. So, and is widely internationally recognized trade expert, and we are very pleased to have you join us today. So, without further ado, if you have any questions to the participants, thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, comments, please put them in the chat box. After the lecture, we will open the floor for Q&A, and hopefully we'll have some time to consider those. So, Professor Akikugbe, if you may, could you please run us through begin your keynote speech by talking briefly about the trade agreements and how this can impact Nigeria's trade relations? 15, 20 minutes, if you don't mind.
Okay, so thank you to you, Dr. Adeoyeni. It's first to say equal thanks for the invitation, and to just acknowledge the very important work that you and others in the International Law Association Nigerian branch, all those who serve in its leadership positions, are doing, which is heavy lifting work to profile international law practices in contemporary Nigeria. Thank you for all that work. So maybe in about, maybe less than 15 minutes, so that we can have more time for maybe good interactive discussions. I will first sort of highlight some key points that I think are essential to thinking about the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements today, in particular once we're examining its implementation. This agreement that went into legal became very legally entered to legal force in 2021 is potentially now up for some kind of assessment. That assessment and the report around it is being done, but some reports have been published by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, that takes account of progress that has been done, and progress here I'll put in quote, and challenges that has to be addressed as well. So I think one very point I like to make at the onset is the context within which I will offer, the few remarks I'll offer, um, isn't to be too critical of the AfCFTA or its implementation, and I'll say why once I get into it. Rather, it is to try to acknowledge what are the key areas that I think the agreement has tried to move forward, but also identify the areas where, as we can see, key policy offices across the continent, in addition to the AfCFTA Secretariat, are trying to ensure that this particular agreement makes further progress through its revision mechanism. So, in essence, I would say, there's a thing around cautious optimism that I would say that underpins this point. The first I'll talk about is, when this agreement was signed in 2018, 19 or so, the Trump administration was then in its first era. And folks will recall that, the noise around the global economic order was more around the, China-US trade war. And at a time when it looked like multilateralism was under significant retreat, African states that have always been queried for their non-serious approach to multilateralism and economic integration, particularly at the regional level, we're moving forward in what is a very pivotal agreement in the long history of economic integration attempts in the continent. And so it is important to not forget the fact that there are geopolitical contestations that matter once we are discussing issues of impact or success or assessment of these types of agreements. These geopolitical contestations matter because for a continent like Africa and a country like Nigeria, the way in which we have traded over time has can be impacted significantly by shocks or changes that are not anticipated in the global economic order. And so that's the first thing I like to put on the table. And so once we think about these few years of the AfCFTA, we can also imagine that there has been Ukraine-Russia war. There was the pandemic that happened. There are a series of bilateral trade agreements that are being negotiated. And in fact, new kinds of agreements that has significant levels of power asymmetry between them are emerging. And all these have some form of impact on how we think about the AfCFTA. The second point I'll make, which is not sort of new when I talk about these types of agreements, is that when we get into the Nigerian context in the next few minutes, it is important to question or query the notion of implementation. And its simple form, it will look like, we have agreed under this trade agreement to commence trading once this particular percentage of ratification has been achieved, right? And so we should just go straight into, our legal obligations under the trade agreement, what we have agreed to liberalize under the 90% agreement or the 77% and the 3% that are not up for trading. But in fact, what I would like to say is that that is only just one approach to thinking about the implementation of trade agreements. And that in a region like Africa, with its past challenges that we've had in terms of non-tariff barriers, in terms of challenges around infrastructure and connectivity, or even air transportation, and in fact, transportation within the countries themselves. We have to not forget those, social contexts that matter once we are imagining what implementation is like. In fact, equally important is the fact that we cannot rule out the impact of social conflict within the continent of Africa once we're thinking about it. In essence, we cannot be too formalistic about our assessment of these kinds of agreements because doing so, in fact, ignores very important and underpinning ideas that impact how much we imagine the assessment of this agreement. And whichever view one has of the implementation of the AfCFTA, we get to Nigeria, I'm just walking around impact here. The AfCFTA had tried to move through its guided trade initiatives measure that has countries from all over the continent, geopolitical zones, north, south, east, west now, that have participated in different kinds of trading activities. And so, Nigeria, started its own movement of cost containment to another part of country recently, but so has Kenya, so has Ghana, so has South Africa. So there's a way in which, even though the safety agreement itself isn't going at full steam, all hands are not just waiting for that time when it can kick off. There's some attempt to get us moving. The third point I would make generally in this area of the ideas that underpin my more specific assessment of conversation we'll have around Nigeria is that there's importance the importance of transcending the extractive sectors in which we imagine most of the economies around African countries is more urgent and cogent than ever before, right? And so in today's language, you'll hear things like global value chain supply, in the critical mineral sector, for example. There's a lot we're talking about there about the need to do more than just being providers of the critical raw materials, which is similar to how we've been providers of, agricultural products or commodities over time, or even in the oil and gas sector, which is all changing to some extent if one takes a more nuanced approach to them, or even how we assess our trading between ourselves. And so whether it is in the agricultural sector, the digital technologies, services, financial sectors, businesses generally, or intellectual property rights or competition law regimes, it is critical to not lose sight of the fact that where we are would call for a much more urgent and very concerted effort by African leaders to not be too rudimentary about how trading is happening, right? In fact, a lot of what is the critical way in which most developed nations trade today, if you think about issues around chips and the manufacturing of very critical materials, around technology, African countries are not just really playing as such in that field. You add to all these are all overall development problems around, gender diversity, around climate change, around, economic policies that are designed to support the economy. It paints almost a gloomy picture of what, assessing the impact of the AfCFTA might be, especially when you think about the fact that we're still struggling with consistent manufacturing because of, poor power supply in major parts of the continent. But our discussion in the Nigerian context, I think, puts much more substantive examples on these broader ideas, which should sort of give us some hope, rather than the very pessimistic picture, some hope that, it may not look like what we expect it to be in terms of the trading and going full force for African countries, but they are indeed doing more than they used to. And so maybe in the next few minutes, we can have questions that are geared towards that in the Nigerian context. Thank
Well,
you.
yeah, well, very well. That's quite a lot to chew on within a short period of time. But thank you very much for those comments on African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And if I could just, as a follow-up, especially with your third point, when you talk about transcending the already sectors, development sectors that we have in Africa, and whether African countries are, tapping or utilizing the critical raw materials. I wanted to ask whether you can whether we can identify some key strategic sectors, especially in with regards to Nigeria, where Nigeria stands to benefit more from Continental Free Trade Area Agreement? Is it just one sector like the critical raw materials, or is it agribusiness? Where are those sectors, and how can countries, especially Nigeria, leverage their dominance in a diversified intra-African trade balance?
Okay, so there's a lot in that question as well, but I'll try to have a go at it. I think it's one place to sort of start before enumerating some of these more direct responses to your question is that it used to be said of Africa, right, that, and it is still said in many ways that, we have similar products. You look at West Africa, you can say, oil, the agriculture, palm oil, and things like that, so that it is similar, right? And therefore, the argument goes, well, we don't then trade with each other because there's really nothing
Hmm,
in terms of the classical economics way of thinking about trade. But what we know of, contemporary trading practices is that that's actually not entirely true, because it is only if you take a very narrow view of trading that those kind of arguments will sit.
yeah.
You can imagine that Nigeria has, of course, many sectors that stand to benefit from the
Hmm,
AfCFTA. But as your question requires the identification of some of the economies that are likely to benefit the most, then let me take those on. You can imagine this in the context of trading goods or
hmm,
trading services,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And in the context of services, which I think is where, for reasons I will say now, it's good to start from.
Hmm,
Trading goods requires a lot more, in terms of the architecture that a country has in place, in terms of the infrastructure that a country has in place, to not just be producers of raw materials, but actually manufacturers,
hmm,
right? Industrialization in its true sense
hmm,
is what we're talking about here. And Nigeria has some things going on there, right? But we know the challenges are not also non-existent, right? So in the services sector
hmm,
in particular, Nigeria is actually being recognized as a leader
hmm.
in the digital economy in the African continent.
Wow.
Of course, one can think about this by saying, if you look at the strength of its youth,
Hmm,
if you look at the strength of in which innovative technologies in the financial sector, for
hmm,
example, has been developed in Nigeria despite its challenges in the
hmm,
past, decade or so,
hmm,
you would understand why the African Union has recognized Nigeria's digital trade profile as
hmm,
one that deserves this recognition on the continent. So Nigeria's digital trade landscape is critical here. And if you think about the work that the Minister of Trade, Investment and Industry, the offices of Nigerian offices of trade, negotiation, and the AfCFTA implementation offices that coordinates this in the Nigerian sector.
hmm,
They've done series of trainings over time,
yeah.
over the past few months or a
Hmm,
year and a half, actually, trying to increase the attention that should be paid to Nigeria's capacity to really take maximum advantage
hmm,
of its digital economy where it is leading.
hmm,
And so if you think about, fintech, e-commerce,
hmm,
digital payments,
hmm,
a very vibrant creative industries,
hmm,
which we have in Nigeria. It's easily one of the leading, if it's not still the leading in terms of creative industries,
hmm,
are areas where Nigeria, can and should continue to take advantage of the AfCFTA in its immediate, right?
hmm,
Another category we must think about beyond the digital economy and the subsectors
mm,
under there, which I alluded to, really is still agriculture,
mm,
and manufacturing. They are essential. This is a conversation about Nigeria. So
mm,
one thing that has been occupying my mind in recent times is this song from primary school days, where, for those who don't speak Yoruba, I'll try to interpret it, but they will say, we'll be queuing into the classroom, and one of the songs will go, Iṣẹ́ àgbẹ̀ níṣẹ́ ilẹ̀ wa, ẹni kò ṣiṣẹ́ á máa jalè. You see that, agriculture, farming,
yeah,
is critical
yeah,
to our economy.
yeah,
And I don't know if they sing this kind of songs in primary schools today,
mm,
but you do see many people trying to invest in the agriculture sector,
mm,
precisely because
mm,
it is fundamental.
mm,
And you see, in the US, it is one of the economies they don't joke about
yeah, mm,
at all. And it is one that African countries and global South countries, under the auspices of the Doha negotiation round of the WTO, tried to center their own issues, but has been well frustrated,
yeah,
almost out to failure
mm,
by powerful countries.
mm,
And so Nigeria in this renewed era, which I think in this particular republic, era
mm,
of democratic governance has consistently,
mm,
grown in importance,
mm,
is critical. But it's not just about producing
mm,
primary produce, like cashew nuts that we
mm,
export,
mm,
oranges or
mm,
tomatoes,
mm,
amongst many other things,
mm,
that we produce in the agricultural sector.
mm, mm,
But it is to actually transform them, right, into tomato paste, into tomato juice, orange juice, and so
mm,
on and so forth.
mm,
It's also, this is very anecdotal, but we export a lot of cashew nuts. And
really?
growing up, I eat cashew, right? You could
Oh,
buy it.
yeah,
Today, you go to Nigerian markets, you don't see cashew,
yeah,
but you can see cashew nuts
yeah,
exported,
yeah,
right? So there's something in there that, I think can be taken
mm,
advantage of beyond the very anecdotal, simple example, of course, that I've
mm,
given or relatable. The manufacturing industry,
mm,
it's essential, right? And we do have Nigerian industries, that
mm,
are doing a lot,
mm,
that we know about and that are
mm,
defining this, but the government must throw their weight behind that.
mm, mm,
Business services is another one that is critical,
mm,
right?
mm,
Professional services, law firm services,
mm,
right? You think about the coordination that is going on in some of the law firms that are existent in Nigeria and Africa today.
mm,
There's leadership that is going on in there.
mm,
And there's a whole bucket of services that is critical to that.
mm,
So what I'm trying to say with this first point around, the services
mm,
aspect is that, we have to not forget the fact that trade in services is an area where the
yeah,
African continent free trade
yeah,
area agreement state parties have agreed to liberalize priority
mm,
sectors such as
mm,
the financial services, transport services, communication,
mm,
tourism, as well as professional services. And these areas provide very important
mm,
aspects that Nigeria, as it is already doing, can
mm,
continue to ensure that it supports its teeming industry, that it drives it meaningfully, and that it owns where it can the leadership that needs to be provided in these areas.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. But let me just speak on agribusiness. But what about those who argue that, I mean, agribusiness in Nigeria so far significant technical and complicated challenges in terms of, preservation, storage, especially if you're going to export, raw meat or even other fruits like cashew that you said. Do we have the technical or scientific innovation and competence to be able to export a product, competing with countries like South Africa and even Kenya, um, who might be edge above us. I don't know if you have any response to that.
That's a good follow-up, Dr. Abe. So I think you're right.
Mm,
Okay. 2 weeks ago, I was actually in Morocco and I
yeah.
was, speaking similar,
Mhm,
saying at the keynote. And, I started by saying, look, before I left Canada, a day before then, I was in the store and I was buying groceries and I bought tangerines from Morocco. I love the oranges from Morocco because it tastes very well, right? And then I'll later be in Abidjan, right, where I also sought out the orange because I wanted to see the difference in tastes and
mhm,
how the countries were actually working with them beyond just providing oranges. And so you're right in terms of the fact that, look, when it comes to what it means under the language of trade lawyers, sanitary and phytosanitary provisions and
mm,
agreements, excuse me,
mm,
that relates to standards by
mm,
which the growth, preservation, and international trade in this
mm,
kind of
mm,
agricultural
mm,
products, right,
mm,
can be done.
mm,
And it's not unique to Nigeria, but we can do much better than we're doing
mm,
in terms of ensuring that the processes by which we cultivate and harvest those products at first meet the international standard, right?
mm,
For example, it means there are particular types of pesticides you don't use. There's a measurement about how you harvest them, how you preserve them, the logistics around moving them, the value, right, that is preserved as a result of how you throw them. I mean,
mm,
we mostly on this call are Nigerians. If you travel from Lagos to Ibadan, even if you
mm,
haven't gone to the south, east or the west,
mm.
excuse me, or the north, you would see lorries of oranges just
Yeah, yeah,
right,
mm,
and you hope the lorry doesn't, the truck doesn't go bad along
yeah,
the way because then
mm,
it's all finished, right?
you're
And you
right.
see the same for tomatoes, right? So that's what we're talking about. But
Mm,
if you imagine how banana, very important fruit, which has been the subject of significant trade disputes,
mm,
is transported from, say, Peru to
mm,
Canada.
mm.
Its presentation is
Yeah,
unbelievable.
yeah,
And we have banana, we
absolutely.
have plantain. We
Yeah,
can't do that.
yeah,
You're right. You look at
yeah,
Kenya, you look at
yeah,
South Africa, you look at
yeah,
Morocco,
yeah,
right? Kenya around its avocado,
yeah.
for example, South Africa around its oranges,
Mm-hmm.
same as Morocco. So there's that, and it's all SPS agreement
Mm,
issues.
mm,
But Nigeria can, and we are seeing it. There's investment in rail
yeah.
sector, right?
Mm,
Transportation is one bit of
mm,
it.
mm,
The government is doing it more, on
mm,
the rail passengers, but we need it for cargo
yeah,
movement, all
yeah.
right?
Mm,
That is critical. Beyond that, though, will
mm,
be important training
mm,
on how to harvest and preserve
mm,
them, right? When you've really gotten your orange off the tree, how
mm,
do you drop it? How do you keep it? Which
mm,
pack do you put it in?
mm,
And in what state do you make
mm,
sure it is, right,
mm,
before you can get it on the ship? When should you get it on the ship so that it arrives in the country
mm,
where you want it to go to be better? So those are core issues that I agree with
mm,
you on, which I
mm,
think Nigeria can
mm,
improve if it really wants to play
mm,
in the international business in that area. Of
yeah,
course, the infrastructure is also critical. But
yeah.
as I've said, rather than depending on the road infrastructure, which needs significant opening up to
Mm,
connect the regions better. I mean, 2 days ago, a day ago, there was the launch of the Lagos Calabar Road.
you're
Its
right. Yeah.
completion of 30 kilometers. We can only
Mm,
hope,
yeah.
right, that this goes beyond the 30 kilometers and
Mm,
truly connect the country. And
yeah.
it may be an important gateway going forward. But before
Yeah.
then, the rail must also help.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, you mentioned Abidjan. I'm not sure if you tried the Ivorian chocolate, and which is compared to the chocolates we buy here. And considering the fact that, that part of the region of the world is where, a large export of cocoa materials is being exported. The chocolates are usually hard, and you can preserve it for long. But most people, especially foreigners, don't want to eat it because, unlike here where it is soft and for whatever reason, maybe taste. And I think, like you said, it's something we can do much more in terms of infrastructural development, and I think also awareness as well with regards to how we can leverage on this. So another follow-up
Sorry,
before.
sorry,
Uh,
before you move on to your follow-up, I think, on the chocolate issue, it's this is not a chocolate point, but it's actually moves me to the point where, one thing I think the federal government has done very well is we must patronize our products,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, that's what I was
Everybody
trying to
wants
say.
to
Yeah.
eat sweet chocolate,
Yeah.
right? Forgetting that the Swiss do not have a tree
Yeah.
that generates cocoa, one
Exactly.
cocoa,
Yeah.
right? So
Exactly.
it's one pot of cocoa. So
Yeah.
you're right, but I
Yeah.
think part of this kind of conversations is just saying we
Hmm.
must not be
Patronize our
so
product.
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
It's yeah. Yeah. Anyway. So I mean, if that and you've spoken a lot about, areas of strategic sectors and how Nigeria in particular can leverage on these. And I'm wondering, is there any policy or institutional reforms that are necessary in Nigeria to ensure that we participate, we're able to compete effectively under the AfTA? I know you mentioned infrastructure, but in terms of maybe interministerial coordination or any policy or institutional reforms, people who want to, trade on the AfTA, do they have to go through bureaucratic bottlenecks that they have to pass through? Is Nigeria, as I say, Nigeria factor, does it play a role? So are there any policy or institutional reforms that Nigeria can engage in to ensure our effective participation and competitiveness on the AfTA?
Hmm. That's a great question, and I think there are different ways to sort of take it.
Hmm.
And I think at the top is I like to say, look, when it comes to these challenges, policy or institutional, as you said, trading and maximizing and taking full advantage of the AfCFTA, Nigeria is not in an isolated space
Yeah,
in
I
the
agree.
African continent, right? So there's the thing we say, but Nigeria hasn't done this, Nigerian factor, as you refer to it, quote and unquote. And I think it's important to not, to demystify that, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
I think as a second point, it's actually also important. I have not worked, in a federal government public service,
Hmm.
but from my research, one knows that the government oftentimes actually have very brilliant minds that have generated very useful reports on whether it's reforms that need to be done or institutional, developments that should be implemented quickly. And sometimes, it's your point of the coordination and in the implementation of these that challenges emerge, right?
Hmm.
So, so, so Nigeria, for example, recently gazetted the AfCFTA provisional schedule, of tariff concessions, which reinforces its commitment to a
Hmm.
unified African market. It's
Hmm.
not dragging its feet
Hmm.
when it comes to that. It is the country is actually doing what they need to do to be able to take advantage, right, of this agreement in its formal apertures, right? But once you move past, we've signed, we've ratified, we've taken on these commitments, and we've gotten it gazetted.
Hmm.
One core area that remains a challenge for all African countries and even beyond African countries
Hmm.
the need to reduce or eliminate non-tariff barriers,
Okay.
right? Non-tariff barriers are essential, right? Their reduction or their elimination, where possible, is critical to the success of trade in Africa. What do we mean by this?
Hmm.
It's a very, for those who are not so much into trade in an everyday basis,
Hmm. Hmm.
NTBs, as we call them on the continent of Africa,
Hmm.
manifest themselves through a very complex layer
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
regulatory,
Hmm.
administrative,
Hmm.
as well as physical obstacles that collectively, limit cross-border trade.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you think about the physical obstacles,
Hmm.
when the Boko Haram challenges were
Hmm.
at its peak in
Hmm.
Nigeria, social conflict
Hmm.
within a country or between countries,
Hmm.
it made it difficult for goods to go across. That was a trading route
Hmm.
in Nigeria
Yeah.
that we had that going on.
Hmm.
And to think about that became shut
Hmm.
for about 2 years at
Hmm.
row, right?
Hmm.
Until recently, where it's opened up better.
Hmm.
That's a challenge because
Hmm.
produce
Hmm.
from the northern parts of Nigeria couldn't go anywhere,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we didn't necessarily have the capacity to really trade,
Hmm.
or really, excuse me, turn them
Hmm.
into other
Hmm.
uses in
Hmm.
there. The administrative challenges
Yeah.
around getting to the port, how
Hmm.
soon can a container get through the port?
Hmm.
Will they have to stay there for days, which is the
Hmm.
case in some instances because of the paperwork and
Hmm.
regulatory things that have to be done, is a
Hmm.
major challenge, right? So
Hmm.
these are not seen by the ordinary people every day,
Yeah.
right? But they are
Hmm.
a major challenge. The amount of documentation that needs to be done, certifications,
Hmm.
and of course, at times, corruption is a major issue with that as well. So it subjects us to a very vulnerable, level of delays if you think about what it means
Yeah.
for trading. And the regulatory fragmentation can also happen in the context of us thinking just about, countries, right?
Mm.
Locking heads because of their interest.
Yeah, yeah.
Don't forget that the AfCFTA is supposed to be implemented, in line with, its regional economic communities as well.
Yeah,
So in the West African region, the economic community of West African states,
yeah.
you know, to not talk about the francophone focused ones are all there,
Mm.
right? And so,
Mm.
to the extent that you think about tariffs within
Mm.
those regions and how they're
Mm.
working,
Mm.
it's not exactly just a Nigerian issue,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, it's not.
We're currently facing a major crisis in the
Mm.
ECOWAS sub-region,
Mm.
with the three countries that have pulled out
Mm.
effectively,
Mm.
right? And you think about the connection of why they've pulled out. It's a protest
Mm.
against the continued presence of France
Mm.
in these countries. But in pulling out, they have pitched tent with the Russians,
Mm.
right? And it brings out the geopolitics I mentioned, right?
Mm.
And so in doing that, they're like, forget it. We're no longer ECOWAS interested.
Mm.
We're doing the thing ourselves where we are now forming this, tripartite, whatever it is
Mm.
called,
Mm.
and that's where we want to go. And you would see Nigeria and other leaders within the ECOWAS community try their best
Mm.
to salvage the
Mm.
situation. So non-tariff barriers, in its regulatory, in its administrative, in its physical form, are
Mm.
very a major, major challenge. And to the extent that Nigeria can do anything about that,
Mm.
from its own part, it's also dependent on the states that they're playing with
Mm.
in that regard. It shouldn't say Nigeria is exculpated from,
Mm.
from time, she wants to trade, and I'm sure they should and can do that. And I'm sure, with the competent hands we have in these offices at this time,
Mm.
they're thinking seriously about this. But an issue we picked up is around poor transportation
Mm.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
And in my own academic work, I've highlighted this several times.
Mm.
Look, the coloniality of transportation infrastructure
Mm.
needs to be centered.
Mm.
Everything that is generated, the road leads to the port.
Mm.
Right? The connection is not to move Nigeria to Ghana, Ghana to Abidjan, I mean to Cote d'Ivoire coast, and so on. Like the connection is from the extraction point in Nigeria to the Apapa port or
Mm.
to whichever port
Mm.
across the country that flies it out.
Mm.
That's what the Chinese have replicated,
Mm.
right? In some areas, they have companies that have littered
Mm.
the country, but they haven't shown themselves to be true
Mm.
to the country for understandable reasons, right? Because
Mm.
they have a country that they've
Mm.
come from. They want to be a global player. They
Yeah.
are a global
Yeah.
player power
Yeah.
as well. So we must be intentional
Mm.
about transportation infrastructures.
Mm.
And this conversation is not about politics,
Mm.
but the conversation must be elevated.
Mm.
Projects like we're seeing of the Lagos Calabar Expressway
Mm.
must be given the full potential of the way it can redraw the map of Nigeria. Dr.
Absolutely.
Oyenu, it can.
Yeah.
If it is
Absolutely.
done, this won't be about the administration who built it or the
Yeah.
political party who did not build it.
Yeah.
This will surely be about the fact that look at how regions and produce from the Lagos State free trade area
Mm.
can go without getting into any of the traffic that
Mm.
exists
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Lagos, but
Yeah.
and up to Benin and so on
Yeah.
and so forth.
Yeah.
That creates the problem. So,
Yeah.
so that is critical, right? In this, and there are projects, I should say,
Mm.
regionally,
Mm.
Southern Africa, in Eastern Africa, and Nigeria to I think Cameroon,
Mm.
that are trying to do this to
Mm.
enhance the connectivity
Yeah.
between the region,
Yeah.
critical for trading purposes. And I think around those, we need to coalesce and find, how voices can be raised to elevate the conversation around them for the economic and social impact they're likely to have
Yeah.
beyond the mental political value that they bring.
Wow, wow, that's quite a lot to consider with regards to policy and institutional reforms. And again, it also goes back to a conversation of infrastructural development and what role can the government play. I'm someone who is kind of strong on interministerial coordination. As you know, in my business and human rights work, you go to the Department of Trade, they tell you, oh no, we don't do anything human rights. Go to Attorney General's office or somewhere. Attorney General goes there and says, well, this is trade. We focus on justice, other things. So the interministerial coordination, coherence is not really there. And I think it also affects the way business and trade is also conducted out of Nigeria. So
Yeah,
before I go
but
to my
but sorry, before we go, this is interesting again. I said this is more conversation, but that's why you have the Nigeria AfCFTA coordination office.
hmm,
You see, that one is not like the trade negotiation office that we have. It
yeah,
is also not the ministry
yeah,
that overall sees it.
hmm,
So that's in that area, you are right. What is the integrity? The risk is not to reproduce things.
hmm,
And I think, like I said in there, sometimes we are also academics and
hmm,
don't probably have the full picture of all that is going on in
yeah,
government,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
As much as we try to. But I do think with the AfCFTA, Nigeria has actually tried,
Hmm,
and they have support through this Nigeria AfCFTA coordination office to bring resources from
hmm,
different departments that are
hmm,
connected
hmm,
that matter for this to do
hmm,
the work that
hmm.
needs to be done. But yeah, we are interested in the conversations with participants as well. So
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time as well.
Yeah, so yeah, participants, please jump in. As the questions, the comments, I know there are some trade experts here, academics, practitioners. Let's hear your viewpoint about how Nigeria can leverage its potentials under the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to do that. Or you want to send in your questions, please also feel free to do that. So my last question to you, Prof, is with regards to local content requirements. Nigeria is big on local content requirements. It actually has a law on that. It wants to protect its industries. It took it a while to actually sign the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The South African president at some point had to be pleading with then President Buhari to sign, and Nigeria is a key economic actor in on the continent. And the rationale then was that we're trying to protect the business. And again, in your introductory keynote speech, you made reference to the U.S. Global trade, economic order, how it's reshaping the global economic order in the name of Africa First policies. So, I mean, to some extent, most countries are actually, fighting for their own. So, my question is, what risks or challenges do you think the trade agreement pose to Nigeria's domestic industries? Does it protect? Does it enhance? Does it limit? Businesses for local domestic industries, and how can the government and private sector work together to ensure that these industries are not really, really adversely affected by continental competition? You're muted.
Yeah, so I said, thank you very much, Dr. Yeni, that there is a technical way to answer this, which is where I'll start from, what the FCFTA protocol starts, and then we can get to much more strategic ones, right? So, which is that under the FCFTA protocol itself, and I mean the protocol in trading goods, there are three categories, right, of how you can think about the liberalization of trade, right,
Hmm,
in there. There are goods that are in category A,
hmm,
uh, up to which 90% of goods that the country identifies as such can be traded and liberalized under that.
hmm, hmm,
There is the sensitive products,
hmm,
which is just 7%.
hmm,
And there's the excluded products, which is not up for any kind of liberalization, which
hmm,
is 3%, right? So it needs to be said that within the agreement itself, there's that mechanism
hmm,
on which a country can say, look, this product is so essential to the farm, to the core of my country that I don't want it up for liberalization at this time,
hmm,
right? So the idea that we think of trade, and I'm deliberately not using free trade now because there's the mission, there's the thought around that, free trade, why isn't it free? And no, it's not actually free. It's reduction of tariffs and agreement
hmm,
around, the terms on which your product makes it into my country,
hmm,
right? So there is that, which is the technical one. But
hmm,
there's always the risk that with a country that is doing its best to climb
hmm,
the ladder of
hmm,
industrialization,
hmm,
uh, we can really quickly, our markets can be flooded,
hmm,
right? And again, there's dumping that happens in that way. There are rules around which the agreement and under the WTO
mm,
those can be dealt with. But your question around protection of industries, particular domestic industries that Nigeria considers critical, that it wants to nurture.
mm,
The tariffs, can be a way to do that. They can decide not to put those in the 90%. They can put it in the 3%, of
mm,
course. There's that, but it is essential to not think that by going into this trade, we will essentially be eroded completely. Of
oh,
course, the risk is there, right? If you think about a lot of the products in the market today. I mean, Dr. Yeni, think about even milk,
mm,
right? Peak milk, Dano milk, all
mhm,
the kinds of big three crowns that we have. I'm sure there's so many others now.
yeah,
There are queries around, for example, peak milk
mm,
being, that we've been consuming for years, and the
mhm,
sort that's been imported from Europe,
mm,
right? That's not a free trade AfCFTA issue right now.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
one that's existed long before the
yeah,
AfCFTA.
yeah,
So there's
absolutely.
no shortcut
Mm,
around industrialization.
mm,
There's no shortcut about African money by its, allies
mm,
being invested in Africa,
mm,
being invested in the country that is
mm,
relevant
mm,
to drive development.
mm,
And so, to speak of Nigeria, you think about, Alhaji Dangote's, you
mm,
think about Tony Elumelu, you
mm,
think about, the Eliza days,
mm,
so many years, you think about, so many entrepreneurs across the length and breadth of the country.
mm,
When government supports them,
mm,
it is essential because they are the ones who will drive a lot of these industries that matter for our
mm,
own development. Of
mm,
course, protectionism is a tool in trade. Every
yeah,
country
yeah,
uses it. It's part of the game. How
mm,
you do is what is essential,
yeah,
right, in this context. And so that's where I'll leave it. I don't know if folks have questions, but I don't think that the AfCFTA is fundamentally a threat to us if we think about it vis-a-vis African countries.
yeah,
The
mm,
system that is a threat to our economies is the one that exists in the global economy, which is that there's no way to match the productivity of China today. For example, if you don't have electricity, it's just basic,
yeah,
right? You will continue to export out of the country.
yeah,
Yet,
yeah,
when you have petroleum, infrastructure that has been put in Lagos like that, we must
mm,
be careful not to politicize everything as
mm,
well, because
mm,
for the first time, we are not talking about the non-productivity of Port Harcourt or
mm,
other kinds of refineries that we
mm,
have,
mm,
and everybody is looking at the fact that we are seeing for the first time perhaps
mm,
true play of demand and supply,
mm,
and stake the price of gas,
mm,
which may be uncomfortable, but it's beginning to show us how the economy really works in that
yeah.
area. That's not to excuse the fact that there might be general problems that are articulated, that one can articulate it more clearly about trading and its very asymmetric nature. But again, yeah, I think there may not be time to dabble into all of those.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I believe the CAFTA actually enhances domestic remedies, considering it's one big market and you're able to export to your products within that market. Uh, which you might not have been able to do if you were to do one-on-one under existing maybe bilateral trade agreement with all its. I mean, we have one free market within West Africa, and in recent times we see countries like Ghana actually giving Nigeria in particular more onerous requirements for Nigeria to be able to export trade. So, but there's always been that nationalistic tendencies and policies in any potential trade agreement. Are there any questions or comments from participants? We have about 5 minutes more before we wrap it up. Um, May Abassi said, from a wider business perspective of expansion of businesses and markets, how do we leverage regulatory coherence and regulatory collaboration with our regional partners around that? For example, in the context of digital trade, digital infrastructure, and data regulation. I mean, I must quickly add, I have lots of questions on. I know you mentioned digital trade at your initial statement, but that might take the whole hour. So maybe in future discussions, Abi. But if you may, can you just respond to Onyeme Abbas's question on leveraging regulatory coherence and collaboration, especially with reference to digital infrastructure or trade?
Mm. Thank you. You made it's a very important question, but again, very broad as well. How do we leverage regulatory coherence? Let's pick that part, and regulatory collaboration. The AfCFTA, digital trade agreement protocol is there, right? And while I can't speak to how much Nigeria drove the process, participated in its negotiation, I have reasons to believe we did and tried our best to make sure that the ways in which that agreement has turned out, right, is helpful for us. That's from the point of view of what Nigeria should, could, and hopefully did, right, for the purposes of the agreement, right, for which you can then think about how its national interest, right, meshes well with the regional one. But beyond that, this is where, for the purposes of these types of industry, the developed countries have not just kept their hands folded, allowing us to do all we want, right? There have been concerns raised about the version of the digital trade agreement that was completed, right? Especially the influence of, multinational corporations from the US, from the EU, under the guise of technical support, right? Providing templates, right? Concepts, ideas that really does not favor a lot of African countries in the context of digital economy. How should we do it? The AfCFTA is there. Its negotiation role is ongoing. Whether African countries can really, push back, on the financial support that often comes with its package, right, of technical support from the West will be critical, in my view, to going forward. I have a paper I must read from one of the persons who, I know contributed a lot to this process. But clearly, what they have identified is a frustration around these issues that you have raised here in the context of, whether it's digital trade, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's data regulation. You do see our competition agency, for example, in
Hmm,
Nigeria, the
hmm,
FCPA.
hmm.
Recently, the award they gave against Facebook and the next Meta, the next
Yeah,
thing they're saying is we'll pull out of Nigeria.
yeah,
When
yeah.
the same kind of finding has led them to negotiating and making payments in other regions. So at
Yeah.
the national level, again, this is where I caution one can't just go into that very general saying of Nigeria is not doing this, Nigeria is not doing that. They are doing. They're under Irukere, they did a lot. And part of what they've put in place is what we're still seeing, holding accountability in relation to data,
Hmm,
privacy, and how it's being treated, right?
hmm,
And again, like Dr. Oyeni said, some of these issues are deeper than what one can even try or than I've tried to attempt to
hmm,
answer in here at all in the 1.5 minutes or so. But they speak to why, as an academic, I always say we all have to make sure we write about these issues.
yeah,
Nobody is going to, write about African and Nigerian issues better than the Nigerian,
yeah.
right? So we can't allow the Europeans to come and do this. I love Europeans, but I'm sorry, it's not their primary task to be writing about Nigeria. At the
Okay.
end of the day, you and I have that task, and the work the ILA is doing through its business and human rights, network, through its, teaching and all other ones are critical to this. And I hope, we all take up the task of
Yeah.
supporting them and being in wider conversation in writing about the practices of international law and international economic law from Nigerian and African centered perspectives.
Well, thank you for throwing in thought approach there. We recognize that. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you, Ime. I'm not sure if you have any other questions. In just 1 minute, can you just give us closing remarks? Is there any hope for the future with regards to AfTA and its impact operationalization in Nigeria?
There's hope. If we've lost hope, then there's no reason to do anything. The challenges are a lot. I think, I see names in the audience, so we can chat stories around different ages, and everybody can tell their stories. But I think there are reasons to be optimistic. And in that context, whether you're a practitioner, whether you are, an academic, your tool, your skill should be deployed to highlighting, to supporting, to working on these issues. And as far as Nigeria is concerned, I think that's the responsibility we all have. And you don't have to be in Nigeria to do that. You can do
Hmm.
it from anywhere as
Absolutely.
well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And oh, just another thanks from Dr. Yakire. Thanks, Prof. Always interesting to hear you talk about trade in Africa and the perspectives you bring to the discussion. Absolutely. And on that note, I want to thank you, Prof, for your time, for your world of expertise, for engaging with us and sharing your time with us. Hopefully, you will continue to avail us of that expertise from time to time. Thank you very much. And all our participants, thanks for joining in and the questions and comments. We do really appreciate it. On behalf of ILA Nigeria Committee on Business and Human Rights, we say thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day and have a great week ahead. Thank you, Prof.
Many thanks,
Yeah.
Dr. Yuni. Thank you.
Bye.